Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Skeleton Key Study Group webinar. I'm so happy you've joined us today for this conversation about Joseph Campbell's book, Thou Art That, and the new study guide that the Campbell Foundation has just published to accompany the book, which is available to purchase as of today. The Joseph Campbell Foundation invites you to experience the power of myth. So if you hear that call to adventure, you're in the right place. The name of this webinar comes from one of Joseph Campbell's early books, which was called A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake. The book was a guide to reading James Joyce's novel, Finnegan's Wake. We're using that reference to skeleton keys as the name of our new series of study guides for books by Joseph Campbell. So, for example, Thou Art That, a skeleton key study guide, accompanies Campbell's book, Thou Art That. These study guides are intended to companion you as you read Campbell's work, perhaps help you find yourself inspired by his ideas and even carry them forward into your own work. My name is Bradley Olson, and I'm the publications director for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. I feel fortunate to have the author of Thou Art That study guide with us, Andrew Gurevich. The two of us are going to have a conversation, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. So please feel free to send us your questions via that Q&A button anytime at all. And we do have a promo code to share with you as well. So try, if you can, to resist the temptation to do any book shopping until the end of the webinar. So before we go on, I'd like to introduce some of the intrepid JCF team who are here with us today, making this webinar possible. Can you guys turn on your videos so we can all see you? There we go. We've got with us today the brilliant Stephanie Zakowski, our operations coordinator. The amazing Michael Lambert, who serves as our rights and permissions manager. We have the lovely and talented Stephen Geringer, our community coordinator and author of the book Myth and Modern Living, and the upcoming Myth and Meaning. And myself, I'm the publications director, as I said, the editor of the Foundation's weekly Myth Blast series, and I'm the host of our JCF flagship podcast, Pathways with Joseph Campbell. With that, I'll invite the team to say hello and introduce themselves. Stephanie, would you like to lead off?
Sure thing. Hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and have this rich conversation with all of you today. As Brad said, I'm the operations coordinator, so I'm always watching all the cogs and wheels in the background of JCF. So great to have you here. Thanks.
Michael, you're next on my screen. Why don't you go?
Well, hello, everybody all over the world. And I would just like to add that, here we are. I'm looking at names in the chat from the Netherlands, from California, Oregon, Mexico. I think I saw one from South America. Here we are, really kind of living Joseph Campbell's vision of creating that world myth. So well done. Anyway, I'm the rights and permissions manager for the foundation. I've been connected with them along with Stephen for over 20 years now, Stephen. Whoa. I will be dropping links into the chat and various other quotes and whatnot as we proceed.
And I guess I'll take it from there. I'm Stephen Geringer. Like Michael said, I've been associated with the Joseph Campbell Foundation for seems like forever, but also just a brief moment in time. It's all moved so quickly. Most of the time I've been involved, my main duties have revolved around community. So this event today, a chance for us all to come together and to see that there are other people than just me who appreciate myth and appreciate Joseph Campbell's work. That is one of the things that I really love about these webinars. And send your questions in. You may not form a question until partway through the interview as you're hearing Brad and Andrew talk, but go ahead and enter it into the Q&A when it occurs to you. And I doubt we'll be able to get to everybody. We haven't so far, so I'll be curating those. But we'll have about 20 minutes to plumb Andy's brain.
Well, thank you, guys. Thank you, team, for those intros and for making today's webinar possible. You guys are the best, and it's such a pleasure to have you as colleagues and friends and to do this work together. Now, this is a great time to open up the chat, as Stephen said. So let's hear a round of virtual applause for Stephanie and Michael and Stephen, and for everything they do for the work of myth. And while you have the chat open, let's have a chat check-in. Let us know where you're zooming in from, and if there's a myth or a mythic figure on your mind today. For me personally, I'm in Flagstaff, Arizona, and I've been rereading Sophocles, Oedipus, the Oedipus trilogy, Philoctetes. So this Sophocles had a genuine feeling, I think, for the disadvantaged and the marginalized, and it's beautiful to read Sophocles because there are little gems like I think my favorite is, "One must wait until the evening to see how splendid the day has been." And so hopefully by the end of this webinar, we'll see how splendid this has been. So what are the myths on your mind? Michael, is there anything popping up in the chat about this?
Somebody mentioned Prometheus, which is a good one. Yep. Morella from Mobile, Alabama.
Ah, great. Well, thank you. And again, welcome to everyone. And thank you for entertaining all the myths on your mind today. So let's
hold on, we got a good one here from Stephen. The salmon are running in the Stanislaus River here, so salmon myths are on my mind.
There we go. All right, well, let's move on to what exactly is a Skeleton Key study guide. These study guides were conceived and written for teachers and students, creative people, artists, writers, book clubs, and for you. Each Skeleton Key guide has a chapter summary of the Campbell text and reading lists for further research. It has prompts for discussions. It has essay topics and creative project suggestions. Now, with these study guides, you can discover Campbell's insights and experience for yourself the power of myth. And before I introduce today's guest of honor, let me just note that the Skeleton Keys can open many locks because they've been filed down to just the essential. And Skeleton Skeleton Key study guides work the very same way. We've designed these books to help teachers, students, creatives, book clubs, and all myth-minded readers discover Campbell's insights and experience the power of myth. You'll find concise chapter summaries of Campbell's chapters, reading lists, prompts for discussion, and ideas that suggest creative projects and delving further into your own research through essay topics and so forth. So this is the cover of the new Thou Art That study guide book. And this quote next to the cover is one of those profound insights of Campbell's that the study guide discusses. All of our religious ideas are metaphorical of a mystery. And this is the central theme of this text. And here in the next slide, we'll look at what the pages look like. You see the beautiful images that are paired with the text. And we'll just continue to show you some excerpts from the text. And now you might have developed a small sense of why I'm so happy to introduce to you Andy Gurevich, the author of the study guide. Andy, come on up to the virtual front of this virtual room. There he is. And he's a professor of mythology, religion, and ancient literature. He's the former president of the Association for the Anthropology of Consciousness, an academic organization that studies anthropological approaches to the understanding of consciousness, and is a member of the Editorial Advisory Board for the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And he lives in Portland, Oregon, with his wife and 2 children. And he's the author of numerous rhetorical articles that explore the living presence of the sacred in the human story. So let's give Andy a round of virtual applause for participating with us in this webinar and talking about his lovely book. Welcome, Andy. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you, Brad. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. It's great to see so many people from around the world. I would right off the bat echo what Michael said in his introduction, that we are living Joe's dream of being able to have global conversations about the importance of myth in how we shape our own personal lives and the lives we lead together in this world. So what an honor to be here with all of you.
Well, it's just great to have you here. You've written, I think, as all these study guides have been, in some way, they can stand alone as reading in and of themselves, and I think yours is particularly suited to that. You wrote a beautiful, I think, and courageous introduction to this book, and if you wouldn't mind, that introduction shared your journey in myth and coming to myth, and I think it would be nice if you could share some of that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was raised in a kind of unique setting. My father was in organized crime, and we moved around a lot as a kid. We would move back and forth from the coast, from New York to California, maybe to southern Florida, and then back. And so I spent a lot of time bouncing around the country every 2 years as a kid, and that is disruptive to my life in terms of setting down roots, getting any kind of routine. I was always the new kid. I was always kind of the odd man out, so it made me a bit of a loner. And there was some trauma and stuff associated with the violent upbringing. But what it also did is it gave me an opportunity from a very early age to meet lots of different kinds of people with different backgrounds and different ways of seeing, that great John Berger book, Ways of Seeing. And even from an early age, I was aware of the different ways people approached things like the sacred and how they organized their lives around their value systems and the way they thought. We were secular Jews. We weren't practicing Jews. I didn't go through bar mitzvah or any of that, but there was always this awareness of that component of our own identity. And then when I left home and kind of went out into the world, I probably because of these issues of having a really volatile home life and not deep connection with my own parents, I started looking for that connection. And as the Campbell Foundation put up a wonderful quote this morning about the metaphor of God as Father and how we inhabit that psychologically and then metaphorically. And then when those two come together, Joe said, a kind of explosion occurs, and then we have to reorient our sociological and cosmological worldviews. And that happened to me in my early 20s, and I ended up becoming an evangelical Christian because it was the first place I found where I was at least told that I was going to be exposed to a loving, gracious, empathetic, compassionate father figure. And so I dove into that headfirst for a good while, and ended up because of my curious brain and my desire to do this work, going off to Bible college and seminary. And I was studying, finished seminary degree. So I had 6 years of higher education in Christian theology, basically fundamentalist evangelical. And then when I left, I was training to be in the pastorate, and even was a working evangelical pastor for a couple of years. And then I had a kind of crisis of faith, and it wasn't anything horrific in terms of a big scandal. It wasn't. It was anything that shocking. I just woke up one day, as C.S. Lewis said, but in reverse, and simply didn't believe the things that I had believed before. And what I realized is that I never had. It was always kind of force fit, and I was desperately trying to navigate a space that I never felt comfortable in. And so, like many people in this growing ex-evangelical movement, there's that wonderful book out that you all are aware of by Heather Hamilton, that Returning to Eden. I knew that I no longer fit within the confines of the mythic structure that I had inhabited so much and become a teaching member of, but I didn't know where I did fit. And so I went into a period of kind of disillusionment, some anger at what I had been taught and where it had led me. And I call that period my shaking my fist at an empty sky, because I was mad at the God that no longer existed in my heart. I was mad at that being for not being there and not existing. And I spent a good amount of time there, and I have some colleagues that I went to school with that ended up in the same place and are still there in that period, in that kind of anger at not being able to inhabit their faith tradition the way they sort of were trained to or were raised to. But for me, it wasn't good enough to just stop with the anger. I started teaching on the college level, and I got a job teaching a world religions class, and I realized that I had an extensive amount of training in Judaism. Yeah, Returning to Eden, absolutely, Michael. I had a good amount of teaching background or to teach Judaism and Christianity, but I knew almost next to nothing about the other traditions. And so, but I was now given this job to teach it on the college level. And so I set about trying to educate myself on how to be fluent enough in these traditions to teach them to college students. And that's where I really encountered Joe and Houston Smith for the first time. And they not only provided a scaffolding for me to sort of get into the work in a way that gave me some fluency with the traditions to work with students, but it provided an opportunity for me to sort of reconstruct my own faith tradition in a way that built on these mythic principles and made them much more portable, and the four functions of myth, the psychological, sociological, cosmological, and pedagogical, these were huge and for me to actually reshape that tradition. And so that began this 30-year process of me walking back into those traditions with awe, with humility, with wonder, and noting these moments of surprise and delight as I encounter the traditions, and how they still in a really active and relevant way speak to us at the deepest levels when we can meet them in a less rigid space and actually let them speak to the deeper parts of our hearts and psyche.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the fish shaking at the empty sky, and I think that is an experience that isn't uncommon at all. And I think it's that moment when we realize that, in fact, contrary to what we've been taught, the world wasn't made for us. Those conditions of life that Campbell talks about have been in place for billions of years before there was a hominid eyeball that opened to witness them. And that realization is a bit of a wound, I think, as any opening is. I think openings are wounding. And in your it's either in your introduction or the first chapter, you mentioned Jacob wrestling with the angel. And during that wrestling, he dislocates his hip. And the text tells us that he walks with a limp for the rest of his life. Now, I think that's what happens to us when we encounter the divine, right? We end up being opened up by it, which is also akin to being wounded by it. And then we walk with this limp for the rest of our life. It's not necessarily all rosy and everything falls into place immediately and all of that stuff. And I think we have to realize that it is a remarkable thing, in fact, to continue to walk with the limp.
Yeah, I think you say something important there about that realization that we aren't the starting point. And the thou art that is a really, as I've looked at it, it's a pretty remarkable linguistic algorithm that was developed in Hinduism, but it has corollaries across the traditions, including in the Judeo-Christian one. And it starts with a necessary displacing of the private self as the center of the universe. And that can be, as you said, a wound. It can be kind of terrifying. It can send one into a spiral and give you a kind of sense of cosmic vertigo and loneliness, to be quite frank. But it's in the displacement of the private self that one then can have a genuine encounter with the other, which triggers the capacity to bring the self back into the fold, but just not as the center of existence, the private self. And then one has a totally renewed sense of self. My friend and colleague Nora Bateson, the daughter of the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, she wrote recently that to know that we live in a world where we will change and be changed is to hold an idea of self gently enough to be reshaped without breaking ourselves and those around us. And I think this text, among many things, taught me this idea of not discarding the self, but to hold it with open hands, because we are constantly changing into something. The person I was even before this call started this morning is different than the person I am right now in this conversation, and that I will be at the end of the call. And the only constant in my life is that I'm changing constantly. And so who am I in that flow? And who am I in relationship to you, since we're both changing on a regular basis? And it seems to be that whatever we are, change is an inherent component of that. And so to find a consistency, a commonality, and a basis for a stable identity within that ever-changing flow, I think is the work of not only the mythologist, but the psychologist and in the individual. And I think we've had communal structures to help us navigate that in the past, but we live in a world now where those aren't as stable as they've used to be. So we're finding them for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that reciprocity between myth and culture, myth and literature, myth and philosophy, and myth and psychology, that there's a tremendous reciprocity there, and each one opens up the other in turn. And I think in some ways, in fact, we have to consider ourselves as metaphor too, not just these religious symbols that Campbell's talking about in this book, but we ourselves are metaphors and constantly changing, constantly in transit. And this is it's a challenging way to think about oneself, because it disturbs, the status quo to such a deep degree.
Yeah, some other work I've been fortunate enough to do with you all at the foundation was on the Masks of God series. I'm turning 53 tomorrow, and I believe this was roughly the age Joe was when he was working on a couple of those. And I especially did some work on the Paleolithic era, and I've written on this extensively in terms of Paleolithic art and religious metaphor. And one of the things Jean-Claude said, the French archaeologist, about the Chauvet cave and just about the art in general in the Paleolithic, thank you, Joanna, and everyone, is that fluidity and permeability are two concepts that really infuse the mythic and metaphorical concept of Paleolithic art. And I think that's incredibly important to look at the sort of beginnings of human artistic, metaphorical, spiritual practice. And already that they were front loading these concepts of fluidity and permeability, that this sense of self that we have to hold with open hands, that we are constantly, that really things are more membrane than they are wall. And so things are passing in and out of whatever we would call us on a regular basis, and we are as well. And the quantum revolution has only made that more bizarre and more wonderful and fantastic to navigate.
Well, and this, I think this touches on some of your work with the anthropology of consciousness. It seems to me, anyway, that human consciousness hasn't really changed significantly in 200,000 years. And I mean, you talk about the cave art and Chauvet, especially that is such extraordinary art. And perspective and the complexity of it, and it's if anyone out there hasn't seen Werner Herzog's documentary about the Chauvet caves, it's essential to see. I think it's just stunningly beautiful. But what it says to me is that the same consciousness that created the Addle, created the iPhone. And we haven't really changed all that much.
Yeah, and this is, I think there's this notion, because of kind of cultural, technological change, we believe that we have changed quite a great deal. And this is one of the great insights, I think, of Joe's work, is that we have far more connection to our ancestors, even Neolithic and Paleolithic, than we thought. And so we do stand, whether or not we're practitioners of any particular faith tradition, we do stand in a trajectory of knowing, or at least a way of knowing and a way of seeing ourselves within this larger web of existence itself. And that is very old. The need for that connection is very old. We haven't outgrown that in the scientific age. If anything, it's more acute now than it was. And these opportunities we have to sort of pierce the veil and see behind it a bit, and then gain a kind of wisdom, take a shamanic journey of some kind or another deeper into the self, deeper into the mystery. Even if we don't come back with definitive answers, we come back with more of a relational sense of our deep and profound connection to the mystery. And I think that's what infuses us with the sense of meaning and purpose in life. I know that Houston Smith said of the Gita that it can be read in an hour or in a lifetime. And I believe that Joe's book is the same way, and approaching it. Most of his writing is this way, but this book in particular, it's fascinating to me. A couple of things about it that I'm not sure if people know. This book, Thou Art That, was released. It was the first book released by the foundation in terms of new material, and it's remarkable for a number of reasons. It came out almost 1 month to the day after the September 11th attacks in 2001. Came out on 10/10/01, right? And so what a remarkable time for a book like this to come out, that is exploring the deep connection between these established faith traditions in the world. Someone even in the comment thread is talking about being surprised to see the Thou Art That emphasis on relationship translates. I'm looking at the comment. There's just the comment about basically being surprised that thou art that is including the Abrahamic traditions in this notion of essence rather than pure relationship. And we were at a really volatile time when the book came out. And what's fascinating to me is that when we met to put this study guide project together, it was at the very beginning of the pandemic. I'm sure you remember we met at that hotel in Los Angeles. And I remember as we were putting these projects together, watching reports on the news of this strange sickness that was starting to make its way around the world. And when I went back to the airport to come back to Portland, seeing a couple of people with masks on and thinking, boy, what's going on here? And then 2 weeks later, everything changed. And so we were constantly reminded, and of course, I don't need to tell anyone about the events going on in the world right now, that we live in a world of constant change, but in some sense, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I'll just briefly mention, I saw a man on the news this morning that took my breath away. He was a father speaking, whose son was unfortunately killed in the Lewiston shooting. And the man was saying something very remarkable. He was in tears. And I don't know if you saw this man on CNN, but he was saying that he doesn't have hate in his heart for this person, that he can't imagine what had happened in the life of the shooter to bring him to this point. He can't imagine what the parents of that person must be thinking, knowing that their son has gone this way in life. And he's very sad for what will probably end up happening to this person once he's caught. And at the end, the man just said, I'm just sad that this happened to us, and I'm sad that this happened to him. And I know that God is in charge. And it was so much more than just a person of faith sort of handing things over. He was inhabiting the pain and still finding the goodness and purpose in his own existence there. And that quote from Joe in the book, when he says, you have to say yes to all of it. You have to say yes to all of it. And when you do, you don't become immune to the suffering. You in many ways feel it more acutely, but it has this way of just adding to that deep connection that we have to life itself, to the ground of our being.
Yes, that's I think that's really poignant. And in fact, this kind of thoughtfulness you bring throughout this study guide, and I think that's what makes this such a lovely companion to Campbell's book. You talked about this need for connection and relationship, and I think that may be one of the reasons to study and try to understand myth. I think that puts us in that space of relating to our own humanity and to the humanity of others.
Yeah, boy, you are right. I teach a world lit class, and right now in the class, we just finished up the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the students and Gilgamesh, and the students are currently reading Ovid. And we've had some amazing conversations over the past couple of weeks about these amazing moments in these foundational epics of culture. And just to briefly mention a couple of them, because they all point back to the same thing. In Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh is on his journey to the underworld to meet Utnapishtim, the Noah character who's going to maybe give him this secret to everlasting life, right before he enters into that trajectory, he stops at a pub, of course, to drink up a little before, and the barmaid says to him, Siduri, she basically chastises him and says, "What are you doing? These chasing after these accomplishing these great feats, slaying Humbaba, working on your legacy and making your name great and achieving these wonderful things. This is not the purpose of life. The purpose of life is to go home and be with your people and make deep connections to one another and hold the child's hand and make love to your lover and be with your people and eat and love and sing and dance and then die because this is the nature of man." And Gilgamesh obviously wants nothing to do with this. But the same thing happens in the Iliad. Karen Armstrong talks about that amazing moment, right? So the Iliad opens with an incantation to the muse, "Sing, O muse of the rage of Achilles." And so, even though this story is named after the Trojans, we're told in the beginning that it's a song, a poem about the rage of Achilles. And that rage drives the entire action of the poem, but it also leaves Achilles isolated and separated from his community and even from himself in many ways. And when his friend is killed, Patroclus, and then he goes on the warpath to avenge that, and then kills Hector and is dragging his body around behind him. I'm reminded of what this man said in Lewiston, that the rage doesn't seem to bring his friend back. It doesn't seem to satiate the pain at all. And it isn't until the very end, when King Priam sneaks into the camp to risk his own life to petition for his son's body back, to give him a proper burial, that Achilles sees the man, has this moment of what Campbell borrows from Schopenhauer, this Mitleid, which is translated as compassion or empathy, but it's so much more than that. It's really, as we've been talking about, a displacing of the self, the private self, and really being able to feel the pain of another as oneself. And he thinks of his own father. Both men are moved to tears. They embrace. He gives the body back to Priam, and soon after that, the epic ends. But this is the moment of transformation for Achilles. This is the moment where he really is able to enter his own humanity through that vulnerability, as you said, the wound that allows this element of light to come in, but also to emerge. He had it within him to have that kind of connection to Priam, but his own ego, his own anger, his own sense of pride was blocking that experience. And then I would just say, lastly, in the Odyssey, when Odysseus meets him in the underworld, Achilles says, I made this bargain to die in battle and be known as the greatest warrior, or I could have died in old age and lived a meaningful, plugged in, committed life of love and community, but I chose the valor and the fame instead. And he says, I absolutely made the wrong choice, right? And so even in these epics, we're seeing this orientation in the Homeric stuff, but even before and after, of moving people back towards this deep sense of connection to one another, that there's some awareness that, and the Iliad is a perfect example of thou art that, because the Iliad treats the Trojans with far more, this Greek epic treats the other with far more tenderness and care and humanity than it treats themselves. And so we see in that right away, this thou art that component right in the text, right in the narrative form.
Yeah, that's so true. And I'm so glad you brought that up about Homer. Homer's incredibly more nuanced than one would imagine at a first reading. There's this sense of pathos that runs through the Iliad and the Odyssey in very profound ways, and sometimes it's expressed in these very minor peripheral characters. There's a scene in the Iliad where Glaucus and Diomedes are on opposing sides. They meet on the battlefield, and they remember that they're cousins, and they start talking with each other, and they make this arrangement to not kill each other. There's enough other people to kill, and so they have this little reunion in the middle of this battle that's throwing viscera and gore everywhere. And Glaucus says to Diomedes, I always hear my father's voice in my head. Be the best, my boy, be the brightest, and hold your head high above the rest. And you can see Glaucus kind of going, this is where it's gotten me. And that kind of development of that kind of persona is not what's satisfying ultimately.
No, it's not. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Michael just put a great quote up from the text where Campbell talks about the promised land. And again, what a prescient time to see something like this. And it reminds me of what Joe said in the Mythos series about the wonderful Joseph Epps Brown. I believe the Black Elk Speaks, where Black Elk talks about Harney Peak being the place of emergence in the Central Mountain in his tribe's tradition, in Lakota tradition. But then he says immediately, but of course the Central Mountain is everywhere, right? And what the people can come into the landscape and identify features of it in order to activate the mythology in the lives of the people. But there's not this understanding that this is, in some sort of scientific or geographical sense, the place of emergence. It's designated such, the land is designated such for the purpose of activating the myth in the lives of the people. And I think as long as we keep that in mind, we realize how much power we actually have to shape our own realities and together and individually, that we're not subject to these sort of draconian ancient mandates, but rather free to walk in the world and co-create mythic, meaningful spaces together. And what I think is so powerful about Joe's text is that it's really speaking to how this is, as you said earlier in our conversation, this is not new. I think we frequently paint the ancients as being sort of tribalists and superstitious and not able to think about themselves in relationship to the world, and this level of abstraction and this level of sort of openness. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. The humility and the empathy, and again the surprise and delight and wonder that comes from looking at these things not through the lens of dogmatism or oppositional frames, but really from the sort of the story underneath, the shared story underneath them all that is being told. It really opens the doors for so many opportunities to engage the text anew.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I'd like to go on for hours with this conversation, but time is of the essence, I suppose. Do you have any final thoughts or wishes or advice for the readers of your Skeleton Key Guide?
Yeah, what I really working with the team is so great because Joanna and others kept reinforcing this idea of facilitating folks to have an encounter with the text and to develop their own relationship, and then to do something with it from there, and not just to have a conversation, not just to read something and go, oh, that's interesting, or oh, that's insightful, and then move on, but to have it snag the reader with that sense of surprise and delight, and then animate them to move forward with their own relationship to it. And I really tried to pour in, as an educator, we were talking before, a lot of opportunities for people to respond to the ideas in the text with poetry, with music, with creative writing, with collaborative projects, with developing their own discussion groups, and just ways to really activate community around these ideas. We have a world right now where it's really hard to build community sometimes, especially around these kinds of big ideas that have maybe in some cases led to a lot of division. But Joe's work, to me, I'll just say quickly, has not only facilitated my own pathway back to integration, but I've seen it happen for a lot of other people. And I'll just mention a couple quickly. The philosopher Bayo Akamalafe, I've been a fan of his for years, and he's suddenly everywhere. And his poetic way of taking a sort of animist view of the world and infusing it into modern conversation is really compelling, and he very much has been informed by Joe's way of perspective. Sophie Strand is another author who I think has done amazing things. Yes, absolutely. These two authors have been utterly life-changing in terms of modern writers who are moving the needle a little bit. But the last thing I'll say, because I know we're short on time, is that it was great to participate in the literati study group that the foundation had for a while, where we were working with literati to look at different books and lead these study groups and kind of conversations around them. And the only reason I bring this up here, because obviously we're talking about Thou Art That, but I learned a lot in that group. I was the facilitator for a book called King, Magician, Warrior, Lover. And what was fascinating about that is a lot of people came into the conversation and they wanted to talk about how the book maybe didn't age well, that gendered archetypes, that the king archetype might not be the most welcome maybe in a modern conversation about gender power and gender dynamics, or the warrior archetype. Obviously, how does one manifest that in a world where we're trying to sort of move away from militarized responses to things? And we had such a great conversation in that group because people were able to really understand that they don't work for the archetypes, that the other way around. So for instance, we had a person in the group who talked about using the hero's journey as a template for their own journey for gender reassignment, that they were born one gender, and wanted to be, and found themselves to actually want to and be and inhabit another, and they were able to use the template of the hero's journey to navigate that process. And so this book reminded me more than anything that Joe's work is as relevant today, if not more, than when he wrote it. I think in some ways he was quite ahead of his time and said and did some things that we weren't even ready for at the time, as popular as he was. And I think this book is come of age nicely and really, really speaks some things to us that can help us in the moment.
Well, again, thanks, Andy. And let's go to Stephen. And I think that there's probably a bunch of questions waiting for you. So let's go hear a few of them. Stephen?
I have been enjoying listening to you so much that I almost forgot that I have another task to perform here. Questions are beginning to pop up, plus I was pulling a few out of the chat, and I'm going to try to combine a few of them, which seems to center around Tatvam Asi, thou art that. Jacob asks a question, Tatvam Asi equals Yahweh Asher Yahweh, which is a Hebrew term that, best as I can figure, some folks say it means he brings into existence whatever that exists. So that one sense there. Another person asks, what is your concept of the divine? And then Joanna asks, or pardon me, not Joanna, JP Spaventa ask if you could mention briefly the interpretation of thou art that in the context of an individual's thou relation with the universe, that. So I'm kind of rolling all of these together. Could you just unpack the term thou art that, or Tatvam Asi, for us?
Yeah, I will try to. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, let me do that real quick. No, but yeah, I love the maybe skepticism isn't the right word, but the fact that people are noting the interesting rollover into the Judaic, and I guess I would start here. One of the words that in the Hebrew that Jews use for God is kadosh, and this word is translated as holy in many English translations, but the word actually means something a little more than that. It means set apart, and it means a little more than that. It means other, right? And other, set apart for a particular purpose, right? And so what God is the other, right? And how does one worship God? How does one relate to God? By treating every other that we meet as God, right? And so by embracing the other, this is the hospitality ethic, we are in some sense embracing God. And this actually follows through even into the Christian tradition. There's so much lack of continuity between the Jewish and Christian idea of God. But in the book of Revelation, which is not the best bedside reading, but Jesus says to one of the churches that he's scolding that you ignored me when I needed your help. And they said, when did we do that? And he says, when you've done it to the orphan, when you've done it to the widow, when you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. And so there's a real-time example of thou art that, of right in the New Testament configuration of self and other and identity. It's always this relational identity. There was just an article that came out about that philosopher who's proven, according to his theories, that there is no purpose woven into the universe. And I was talking to some friends about that recently, and I said, to my understanding, purpose is relational. It's a relational component of the universe. It isn't something that's woven into the fabric of the universe, like helium or something, but it's a relational component of how things relate to other things. And so in the Upanishads, when this, to my understanding, and I'd be happy to hear from others as well, when this phrase really starts to take root, is at a time in Hinduism when the religion and the culture were in a period of great change and great upheaval, and there was a lot of corruption in the teachings, a lot of confusion in the teachings, cumbersome rituals that had developed over time in order to facilitate people's connection to the divine, and the people were having a hard time performing all of these, right? And so the religion was under a great deal of change, and this was around the time that the Buddha is finding his way sort of out of traditional Hindu practices as well. And the Upanishads are a record of what they call the close-up teachings of people getting together one-on-one or in small groups in these really relational settings and trying to work their way through their own tradition in a way that activated it again for them. And the phrase that came to them, among others, was Tat Tvamasi. And in the Chandogya Upanishad, it's setting this notion of, in the beginning there was existence alone, God as not a being, but God as being itself, the verb, right? One only without a second, and then this one thinks to itself, let me go forth and be many, and out of itself it projects all things in the universe. But it projects itself into all things in the universe, and in anything that it projects itself, all of it must be, because God cannot be divided. And so if there are 1,000 things projected out of itself, all of it must be in each of those things, right? And so the teaching starts to come around this notion of subtle essence, right? It's always a question of essence. And when you dig a little further down into the self, the yogic practice is about clearing away all of the clutter that makes us unaware of what I would call our original inheritance, which is this direct encounter with the sacred self that we have as children, but it gets educated out of us, or we experience trauma or things that educate us out of it. But in something I wrote for the foundation on Picasso, talking about it took him an hour to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. And he goes on to talk about why that is. And it's because of this direct encounter with the other that a child has. They're not aware of their limitations. They're not aware of the separateness until they become made aware of it through conditioning. And so I think the phrase Tat Tvamasi is, it's hard in our culture where it is so focused on the individual, because it can be, I think, misrendered as you are a God, as a way I can hold on to my private self and keep the ego firmly fixed. And I love to hear that I am God, right? My ego wants to hear nothing more than that. But there's as Brad said, there's a wound and a displacement that has to occur. What the phrase actually says is, and that thou art that. And there's a phrase I use in the book that came to me in the writing of it, is that God is that which is not you, but also you. And I think it's important in the structure to displace the self so that it can then be welcomed back in to the metric, right? To the metrics of relational dynamic. But if we keep the self-centered and then welcome the other in, I don't think that the linguistic algorithm works as well in terms of activating this mythic consciousness. I think thou art that thou art that. And so we center the other as holy, as primary, as sacred, and then the self is brought along into that relationship and elevated back into that sacred space.
Wow. Good job of encapsulating the infinite in a very finite period of time. Very impressive. I'm feeling chills as you talk, because it's striking a chord with me. I'm going to bounce to another question. This is from Joanna, who asks if you could talk about violence and how we can face this force that seems to have co-opted our ability to be in community, the desire to be in the human world that's so dangerous at this point.
Ooh, well, what a great question. I think that what was one of the most profound experiences for me in this book was this exploration of boundaries. And like we were talking about before, Joe blamed for being a generalist and one who didn't respect the differences among cultures. We, at least in my estimation, nothing could be further from the truth. And within our authentic encounter with the other, that we can become acutely aware of the many ways we are similar and the many ways that we are different. And I think it's in that's what I'm looking for, that process of acclamation and also awareness of difference, that we can grow closer to one another. Karen Armstrong, in one of her TED Talks, quotes a line from the Quran, where Allah says, I formed you into different nations so that you may know one another. And there's so much that could be said in answer to this question, right? But what a wonderful line to think about, that I made you separate so you could have the benefit of learning about one another, so you could find your way back to one another and find that shared cosmological home, right? And in that process, you're honoring the differences, you're learning the differences, but while you're honoring, learning, and respecting those differences, what starts to emerge is a really, really deep and in many ways unexpected common core of being. Because as Brad said in the beginning, have we changed that much? Do people want much different than they wanted thousands of years ago? They want to live meaningful lives. They want to live connected to community. They want to experience and give love. They want their children to thrive. At the end of the day, our similarities far outweigh our differences, and they can actually provide a safe place for us to explore and celebrate those differences. But I think violence, primarily, I mean, we can get into a whole thing in terms of the economics of violence, but I think violence in terms of, for our conversation, emerges from fear and from ignorance. And I think when we can address those two things directly, then our response to the other is less inclined to move towards violence and more towards one of embrace.
Thank you. I'll bounce it back over to Brad. There are more questions, but we are running out of time.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. And again, my goodness, Andy, what a splendid way to spend an hour. It's just wonderful. It's been wonderful to hear your thoughts on not just this text that you're commenting on and the Skeleton Key Guide companion that you've written, but just the scope of your interest and knowledge, and it was just marvelous to be able to be a part of it.
Thank you, Brad. I'll just say quickly at the end, just very quickly, you know, I tried to infuse a lot of things in the book that not only honored what Joe was doing and saying, but brought some light to the fact that I really do believe he was well ahead of his time. I think there are some amazing things going on in the meta-modern spirituality movement. Ken Wilber inspired, that speak directly to the things that are in this text. The work of Ian McGilchrist in terms of the hemispheres of the brain aligns perfectly with the things Joe was talking about in this text. And so I tried to bring a lot of that into the space to give people those sort of current connections to the things that the book was about. And just lastly, I would say the editing work by the foundation and Eugene Kennedy in the text itself, and including the Earthrise interview at the end, was so spectacular, because that's just evergreen, right? Campbell's notion that for any mythology to be functioning in the lives and hearts of people, it has to be aligned with the best understanding of science of that time, whatever it is, provided us some permission and some opportunity to continue to do this work, to align our deepest selves with our evolving understanding of the universe.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
That's into the text.
Thank you so much, Andy. And as you say, I think Joanna Gardner deserves just as much credit as we can possibly give her for shepherding this series through to completion. And this is the study guide that we had planned so far. There may be others to come. We'll see. But Joanna just has done a fantastic job with this, and I can't thank her enough.
Joanne was astonishing. And I'll tell you, you know, I had these clear instructions in the beginning, 3 to 5 points of interest, a couple of quotes from the chapter. And the problem is, you know, I'm looking at this thing and I'm underlining everything in every page, right? I'm going through the book and saying every word of every chapter is a key point. Everything he says in each chapter is a pullable quote. And Joanna's like, well, you can't quote everything in the chapter, right? And so she was invaluable in this process of really not only encouraging me, believing in me, but then also just keeping us on target and on focus. Couldn't have done it without her and the whole team.
Thank you, Andy. I treasure every time we get to chat. And
Right.
I look forward to talking with you in the not too distant future. But here, let's give Andy a virtual round of applause first before we move on. Thank you so much. And thank you all. Thank you all for being a part of this. This was a lovely experience, and I appreciate so much your interest and support in what we're trying to do at the Joseph Campbell Foundation. Now, here's the promo code that we promised you. It's Thou Art Wow, all one word. This code is only good for the next 2 weeks on the JCF site shop, which you can get to from jcf.org. When you purchase the e-bundle, just enter Thou Art Wow in the checkout, and you'll get both ebooks for $9.99. It's a marvelous value. So, again, that's Thou Art Wow, jfc.org, and go to our shop. So, before we wrap up, one final thing. I'm thrilled to announce that a new book in the collected works of Joseph Campbell is coming out soon called Myth and Meaning, Conversations on Mythology and Life. This book is a collection and compilation of question and answer sessions from Campbell's lectures, edited by our own inimitable Stephen Geringer. And so we're so excited to be making this book available to you. It will be available for purchase November 14th, but you can register today for our next webinar where we'll discuss this book with Stephen. And the webinar will be on December 9th. So mark your calendar and save your spot today. And I'm going to be having a conversation with Stephen on December 9th about his new book, Myth and Meaning. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, I can't thank Andy enough. And also Stephen, as usual, great job. Michael, you were fantastic today. And Stephanie, thank you. Couldn't have done this without you. We'll leave the webinar open for a few minutes. So
Brad, I
guys...
dropped a Meister Eckhart quote in the chat about the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me, because I just wanted to really make the point quickly that in the Jewish and Christian mystic traditions, this notion of thou art that is very much alive, even though we might think from outside the theology, this God is other, is primal. In the mystical traditions, it's exactly the opposite.
Thank you, Andy. That's a great note on which to end. And as I said, we'll leave the webinar open for a few minutes. You guys can wrap up any conversations that are going on in the chat and copy any links that appear there that you need. I hope you enjoy the Thou Art That study guide. Please post your review on Amazon and on social media. And most of all, join us for the next webinar on December 9th as we talk with Stephen about his new book. Just have a fantastic day and a great weekend. And my appreciation to all of you. And we'll see you again. Bye-bye.